high-tech industrial site now lost to dense forest.
Without that production, Hitler's war machine would simply grind to a halt.
A giant chimney stack that became a towering inferno over Baltimore.
It's really, really sturdy, almost overbuilt walls, because they were afraid of a collapse from wind or some other natural disaster.
An abandoned tower consumed by a bizarre force of nature.
It's a very strange picture because what was there before is no longer there now.
And a mysterious installation that waged a Cold War in Berlin.
It was so brazen, it must have been a giant middle finger to the USSR.
Once, they were some of the most advanced structures and facilities on the planet, at the cutting edge of design and construction. Today, they stand abandoned, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. But who built them, and how, and why were they abandoned? On the Baltic coast of Poland, near the village of Police, is a 450-acre fenced-off area of forest. Smashed concrete structures litter this overgrown site. Skeletal buildings riddled with collapsing walls, underground shelters, and a network of tunnels.
Hidden under the trees in northern Poland is this labyrinth of concrete structures. It's quite clearly something that was industrial. That kind of thing does not happen overnight, and not without a vast investment of time and money.
A group of mangled structures are clustered together at the heart of the forest, flanked by the pulverized remains of tower blocks and a strange brick-colored tower that soars over the trees.
When you look closely, there are clues to tell you exactly what happened there. On the side of one building is marked in German, Coal Bunker 4. And then not far away, there's the remains of what was, quite obviously, large storage tanks. And right there, those two elements are at the core of the story and tells you what happened there.
What was the purpose of this site? What events took place here? And why was it abandoned? In the 1930s, the town of Police was part of Nazi Germany and would play a major role in Adolf Hitler's plans for war. Germany had already been rearming in secret for years when Hitler openly announced his policy of rearmament in 1935. Hitler, however, faced a critical obstacle to building up his military forces.
Very few people know that Germany really lacked the natural resources required to fight a major war. Apart from coal and water, at the time, pretty much everything else was imported. And that critical lack played a huge role in Hitler's preparations for war.
One crippling energy shortage outweighed all others, and that was fuel. Without it, not a single aircraft could fly, ship sail, or tank roll across the battlefield.
The Germans suffered from real constraints in all of their operations from fuel. Through World War II, the prime mover, the main transport, was the M1A1 horse, pulling a wagon.
Germany had almost no fuel and was therefore heavily reliant on imports. In the drive to become self-sufficient, they set out to create their own. The modern equivalent of almost £1 billion was spent on this site, the Police synthetic oil plant. In 1937, construction started on the huge industrial complex. This was no ordinary refinery, but rather a state-of-the-art facility that used a revolutionary new process called hydrogenation to turn Germany's coal into oil.
The Germans use methods to make fuel out of coal that were developed in the early 20th century on to the mid 20th century. They produce beautiful fuels, but they produce fuel that is very, very pure, but mind-bogglingly expensive.
The synthetic fuel is created by liquefying powdered coal. In a reactor, a mixture of heavy oil, hydrogen gas, and a catalyst is heated to almost 400 degrees Celsius and subjected to the incredible pressure of 10,000 pounds per square inch. This dangerous process made Politz a lethal environment for its thousands of slave laborers.
The economics of it really don't add up. It's said that it takes 6 tons of coal to produce 1 ton of synthetic oil. And that's before you consider the amount of coal it takes to ship everything around. And whilst for Hitler that may have served a purpose for Nazi Germany, in any other economy, that just won't fly.
After 4 years of construction, Politz finally began fuel production in 1941. At the heart of the plant was the coal mill. Packed around it were numerous storage tanks, distillation plants, pressure chambers, and hundreds of miles of piping needed to carry the vital fuel to waiting trains and tankers offshore. Politz had gone into production just in time to help fuel the 3,000 tanks and 2,500 aircraft that took part in Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's colossal attack on the Soviet Union. By 1943, the plant was producing a staggering 700,000 tons, 15% of all Germany's fuel.
The synthetic fuel plants kept Germany in the war. That was Germany's only reliable source of fuel, and so they were quite dependent on those plants.
Without that production coming out from Politz, Hitler's war machine would simply grind to a halt.
Whilst pivotal to Hitler's war machine, it came at a terrible cost. 30,000 slave laborers were brought in from across occupied Europe and the Soviet Union to operate the complex and dangerous machinery. Nearly half of these prisoners died from the brutal treatment and toxic working conditions at the plant.
13,000 slave laborers gave their lives at Politz alone, and that's something that should never be forgotten.
As Allied forces gradually gained the upper hand, synthetic fuel from plants like Politz became ever more vital for Hitler's armies.
The Germans are really dependent upon these synthetic fuel plants. And when those plants are attacked, then there will be a huge drop-off in the capability. For example, there is no fuel to train pilots. They're producing airplanes, but there's no fuel, and it will become progressively worse.
The critical weakness of synthetic oil was now exposed. It relied on coal to make it, but coal was desperately needed by other industries, power stations, and even the trains and ships that were taking the oil away from Politz itself. There simply wasn't enough fuel to go around.
The German war effort has got to expend a lot more resource on burning 1 liter of high-test aviation gas than the British or the Americans or the Russians. The Germans are fighting a much more expensive war because they haven't got key resources.
By late 1944, Politz was within reach of Allied bomber fleets operating from Britain and Italy. And in January 1945, they unleashed a devastating 14-minute air raid. More than 1,600 bombs pulverized the plant. This hammer blow mortally wounded the German war machine.
Once the campaign gets going, you see a dramatic drop in German oil reserves and in the supplies available for the German army. And this impacts the German operational effectiveness quite severely.
By February 1945, the Red Army was closing in. The chemists and engineers running operations fled west for safety. And after the war, the Soviet Union looted the remaining equipment, leaving the ruins of Politz abandoned. Today, the remains of this once high-tech refinery are accessible and can be explored with care. They are a forgotten monument to oil production, the Achilles heel of Hitler's Third Reich.
The Allies pulled out all the stops to try and bring production to an end. And if you visit Politz today, there's evidence of that everywhere. Huge craters in the ground, roofs of all these buildings destroyed, some buildings completely turned over. The devastation there was phenomenal because it was so important for the Allies. That was their means of bringing Nazi Germany to an end.
Politz reminds us of the horror of death. It reminds us of mass enslavement under cover of war. And it reminds us of the Nazi idea that cruelty and enslavement could create fuel where there was none.
Over 4,000 miles away in the heart of Baltimore, Maryland, looms an incredible yet largely unknown structure. Hemmed in by office blocks, this tower is from a bygone era and is, to many of the city's inhabitants, an enigma.
If I was just randomly driving through Baltimore and I saw this massive brick structure in front of me, I think I'd be pretty confused, to be honest, because I would think, is it a chimney for a factory? Is it part of a power plant? Is it even for storage?
It was the tallest structure in the United States. Not only was it made of brick, but it was made of so many bricks.
The tower reaches a height of 215 feet. Pierced only by a few deep-set windows, it soars high above the surrounding streets. At the base of the tower is an iron door that leads through the 4.5 feet thick wall and into a hollow shaft. Jackson Gilman Forlini is an historic properties coordinator and works for the preservation of the city's historic buildings.
It is quite a climb. I mean, going 215 feet, it's over 13, 14 stories high. It really is an engineering masterpiece, and this really was untrodden ground.
Wooden beams rise up out of sight, supporting bizarre zigzag-shaped iron brackets. Around the walls, a creaking staircase leads to the summit. The smooth surface of the tower's interior is testament to the skilled workmanship in laying the kiln-fired clay bricks. The intricate wooden framework lining it reveals the complex engineering that went into its construction. But what was the purpose of this mighty building, and why was it abandoned? Decades after the War of Independence, the American military was again in conflict with Great Britain. During the War of 1812, when the British set fire to the White House, the American military was still reliant on imported ammunition from France, Holland, and Spain. Unable to manufacture the huge quantities of ammunition they needed, it was a crucial weakness in their defenses.
The United States at the time that this was built was still a relatively young country that was trying to come onto its own on the world stage. And therefore, it needed a way of producing military armaments quickly and inexpensively.
In 1828, Charles Carroll III, a surviving signatory of the US Declaration of Independence, laid the foundation stone for this, the Phoenix Shot Tower. This vertical factory made lead musket balls and round bullets called shot. It was designed to produce 100,000 bags of shot every year, each bag weighing 25 pounds. To construct this impressive building, it required the production of well over 1 million bricks. This presented a potential problem.
The limitation of the structure was probably due to the compressive strength of the brick at the bottom, right? You can only make it so high before the weight of the structure above just crushes the bricks at the bottom.
Despite this, the extraordinary new building began to take shape. Yard after yard, it reached farther into the sky. The need for such height lay in the science.
At the time when the shot tower was constructed, guns would shoot spherical, basically lead projectiles out of them. And the most efficient way to do that is to pour molten lead from a height, which as it falls, the molten lead coalesces into a sphere, almost like a perfect sphere.
The process was invented by William Watts of Bristol in 1782. The same year he built the first ever shot tower. The technique relied on an ingenious use of physics to achieve the perfectly round bullet. Tons of lead were hauled to the top of the tower and heated to nearly 330 degrees Celsius to create molten lead. This was then poured through a copper sieve. The combination of surface tension and friction with the air turned the falling drops of molten lead into perfect spheres before they hit a cooling pool of water at the bottom of the tower.
You're basically using gravity, you're using physics to create a sphere, so it makes perfect sense. But clearly what you need for that is a lot of height. And how do you get height? It's by building a massive brick tower.
Building a 215-foot tower presented major challenges.
They didn't really know entirely what they were getting themselves into. Incredibly, no scaffolding was used to build this. It was built entirely one level at a time, slowly building bricks as they went up. It's really, really sturdy, almost overbuilt walls, because they were afraid of a collapse from wind or some other natural disaster. And so this tower is really strong as a rock because of those super thick, load-bearing masonry walls.
But with no scaffolding, the tower's sheer height made working conditions extremely dangerous. This led to the introduction of one of its most distinctive features.
That cast iron metal track, it looks kind of strange, and a lot of people ask what it is, but it's actually an early braking system for a kind of elevator.
They didn't just put any old elevator in. They thought about, well, what happens if a rope actually snaps?
There was a terrible accident in which workers fell to the bottom, but thankfully survived. After that, they installed this track so that the box for the pulley system had spokes which would fit into the track. So if there was a breakage, it would very slowly kind of shift its way down to the bottom of the tower, and hopefully no one would get hurt.
Just a year after the first brick was laid, the Phoenix Tower went into production in 1829.
Probably one of the most effective ways that the United States had of making shot. It was a huge production facility that created hundreds of thousands of bags of shot.
For over 30 years, the Phoenix shot tower successfully produced spherical bullets for muskets. Then, on the eve of the American Civil War, more advanced rifle ammunition was developed. New conical-shaped bullets that spun on exit offered greater range and accuracy. This contributed to the staggering casualty rates seen on the battlefields of America in the 1860s. The shot tower no longer had a role to play in America's military production. So the tower created bullets for the nation's civilian game hunters instead. Yet production was brought to a dramatic halt in September 1878, when the wooden interior caught fire.
The flames were shooting out so much that the fire itself could be seen from miles away. The fire burned out all the internal structure of the shot tower, but the bricks itself remained intact due to their inherent resistance to fire.
Well, brick is actually a really good insulator. What that means is it doesn't get very hot or very cold very easily. And because of the thickness of the brick, it actually contained the fire. The heat just couldn't penetrate through this massive wall of clay. And also remember that this clay has actually been fired to much higher temperatures already than the fire would have been producing.
The tower rose from the flames like a phoenix. Just a month after the fire, it reopened for business. Towards the late 1800s, more efficient methods for making round lead bullets resulted in the tower's demise. Hauling tons of lead up a high tower was increasingly seen as too hazardous and inefficient. The Phoenix Tower closed its iron doors for good in 1892. Today, the Phoenix Shot Tower stands as a monument to a bygone era. It helped de-shackle the American military from its reliance on foreign-made ammunition. Yet, without a concerted effort, this abandoned vertical factory would have vanished without trace.
The tower had been purchased by a gas and oil company, which did propose tearing the tower down. However, the citizenry of Baltimore loved it so much and cherished it as a landmark that they rallied together and raised the money to purchase the tower and then donated it to the city government for safekeeping.
Now open as a museum, the Phoenix Shot Tower is more than just a symbol of outdated technology. Not only did this incredible brick factory help to revolutionize the production of ammunition, it was also a vital stepping stone towards the nation's world-leading military industries. Across the Atlantic Ocean in western Berlin, a battered shell of a building looks over a tree-covered hill. This hill is called the Teufelsberg, or Devil's Mountain. The name adds a sinister touch to the strange structure rising out of the trees.
At first sight, all you're thinking is, I don't know what this is, but it's an eyesore.
It looks almost like an ancient Prussian castle. And suddenly, it turns into a bizarre, modern facility strangely perched on a peak overlooking the modern city of Berlin.
Towering 260 feet above the surrounding plateau is a central tower topped by a mysterious dome. Two more tattered domes flank the tower, and nearby, another one rises from the summit. Ragged plastic sheeting exposes their ruined interior. Surrounding them is a sprawling complex of derelict facilities.
This thing is really a hangout for rebels, conspiracy theorists, counterculture, intellectuals, and most definitely graffiti artists. And there's sort of an angry presence to it.
Mystery surrounds this strange ruin. What was its original purpose, and why was it abandoned? In the 1960s, Berlin was at the center of Cold War espionage. The city was divided into 4 sectors. 3 run by the Allies, America, Britain, and France, while the eastern side was under Soviet control. Democratic West Berlin was surrounded and enveloped by communist East Germany, making West Berlin easy prey for the Soviet Union's network of spies.
The American embassy in Moscow is riddled with listening equipment. The American fleet at sea is constantly being tailed by Soviet fishing trawlers bristling with listening equipment. Everybody is shadowing everybody.
Though encircled, America's National Security Agency, the NSA, took advantage of their close proximity to communist Berlin. They built a cutting-edge listening station called Field Station Berlin, known to its operators simply as The Hill.
We had listening posts with large antennas all around the periphery of the Soviet Union, collecting electronic intelligence. And it was especially well placed because it's 150 miles inside the enemy lines in this enclave of West Berlin.
Teufelsberg was a place where we in the West could listen in and get a look inside the operations of the Soviet armed forces.
In 1963, a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, engineers began constructing the new monitoring station on the summit of Devil's Mountain. The foundations of the new complex were dug deep into the ground, but not into standard bedrock. Devil's Mountain is actually 13 million cubic yards of rubble, a mound created with the wartime ruins of Nazi Berlin.
Beneath this Devil's Hill is something really interesting, a Nazi technical college designed and constructed by Albert Speer. And it was designed so well, they couldn't knock it down, so they just buried it.
As soon as the Hill went into operation, the Soviet Union were desperate to shut it down, in large part because its surveillance technology was proving highly effective. In each of the distinctive domes was an antenna, a rotating parabolic radio antenna that intercepted Soviet communications. Monitoring this radio chatter gave the NSA valuable insight into military maneuvers behind the Iron Curtain. However, to maintain the shape of the plastic sheeting over the main dome, the whole structure had to be kept under pressure, with potentially life-threatening consequences.
It's interesting that the iconic radomes are still there today. Now, these were thin plastic put over frames in a highly pressurized room, and we're told, interestingly, that the men who worked there had to go through a decompression chamber upon leaving, or otherwise risk getting decompression sickness.
The Soviets continuously attempted to block or interfere with US Army radio communications. This was a practice known as jamming.
Now, jamming was a standard procedure of the Soviet Union. But in this case, there's not a lot you can do with an enclave that's deep inside your system without jamming your own radio transmissions.
This structure, high up on the hill, it was so brazen, it must have been a giant middle finger to the USSR.
Year after year, the Hill listening station gathered intelligence on the strength and capabilities of Soviet and East German forces. And nuclear missile launcher units were given top priority.
You can learn a lot from military operations from just listening, even if you haven't broken their codes. We understood that when we were on the radio, the other guys were listening. And they understood that as well.
Both sides continuously eavesdropped on their opponents' radio communications. But for more than 30 years, the Hill's location in Berlin, right at the heart of communist Germany, gave the West a crucial advantage.
You're surrounded by a large number of Soviet East German divisions, which are holding maneuvers, which are pushing their radio traffic, and it's a great place to listen to all of their patter, their tactical operational transmissions.
The Soviets failed in their quest. They never managed to put an end to the NSA's surveillance. However, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in 1989, the Cold War came to an end. The Hill became redundant. And as soon as it was decommissioned, it was stripped of its secret monitoring equipment. All that remained was an empty shell. Today, the Teufelsberg listening station is a ruin overlooking the united city of Berlin. Yet, its rebellious status remains intact.
Who wants to remember that paranoia, that imminent destruction? So now it's a graffiti gallery, and maybe that's appropriate. You know, maybe that's even healing.
Even today, details of its surveillance work are classified. But the knowledge and experience gained on this mountain of Nazi rubble gave the US and its allies a lead in signals intelligence that has never been lost.
We are looking at people's bandwidths and transmissions all the time, and it's still a very, very big part of intelligence. In fact, it's probably a bigger part of intelligence today than it was before.
The site now has been completely stripped of all its equipment, so there's no clue about what it actually found. And to this day, it remains highly classified. In fact, top secret.
"430 miles away, on the northern tip of Denmark, a solitary ruin stands in total isolation. The derelict tower overlooks the sea from its position on top of a huge sand dune.
When you think of shifting sand dunes, you possibly conjure up images of the Sahara and vast desert landscapes. You certainly don't automatically think of Denmark.
Perched precariously on this desolate landscape, it overlooks the Skagerrak, the narrow strait of water that separates Denmark, Norway, and Sweden.
When you see this tower emerging out of the sand, I mean, it's eerie, it's mysterious.
It's a very strange initial picture, and that's primarily because what was there before is no longer there now.
The 75-foot masonry tower is topped by a glass-fronted turret. Scattered around its base are the remains of buildings submerged in the sand. The whole structure is precariously balanced on the lip of a sheer sand cliff, 200 feet above the crashing waves.
What really stands out as it rises up into the sky, looms over the cliffs, is when it was built, the tower was strong enough to withstand even the strongest gale. So why was this one abandoned?
In both world wars, this stretch of water, the Skagerrak Strait, was the German Navy's main gateway to the open ocean. This tower witnessed prowling British submarines lying in wait, and the Bismarck sailing to its doom. But centuries earlier, the Danish government had realized its critical importance to trade. To become a global power, they needed to help ships navigate one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the Northern Hemisphere. Jacob Kofod is a guide and curator at this unique site.
It were very dangerous to sail at this sea. There was a lot of storm from the west, and the boats were often come in trouble. So they want to make some lighthouses along the coastline.
With a budget equivalent to nearly £750,000 in today's money, the Danish Lights and Buoys Service commissioned a revolutionary lighthouse. They called it the Rubjerg Knude Fyr. In March 1899, construction began on a complex of buildings on a 200-foot-high cliff. For safety, it was set 200 yards back from the shoreline. From its cliff-top position, the light should be visible across miles of sea and save countless lives.
Now, ships still frequently sail through these waters, and in stormy and foggy conditions, even with the advent of modern technology, lighthouses are still needed for captains to know where the land starts.
After nearly 2 years of construction in late 1900, the light at the top of the White Tower was finally switched on. It was powered by a 550-watt bulb and had state-of-the-art French-made Fresnel lenses to amplify the beam. With numerous glass rings stacked at different angles, the Fresnel lens focused light towards its center. On clear days, this allowed it to be seen from 25 miles away. However, sand picked up by strong winds along the coast constantly clogged its machinery and scarred the Fresnel glass. And engineers hadn't foreseen an even bigger problem.
When it was built, Rubjerg Knude was 200 yards inland and 200 feet above sea level. And miles away to the south was a sand dune, but not just any sand dune.
The Rubjerg Mile is the largest moving sand dune in Northern Europe. For 300 years, 5 million cubic yards of sand crept along Denmark's northern coast at a dramatic rate of 60 feet a year.
It's really hard to imagine that a country like Denmark could have a slow-moving sand tsunami creeping up the coast.
The sand dunes themselves always have a sort of back slope, a windward slope, and then a slip face where the sand gets blown up, it bounces up and falls down the slip face, and slowly, through time, it migrates across the land surface. We can't stop the wind, so we're not going to be able to stop the sand dunes that are migrating because of the wind.
The fact is, this sand dune had been moving for centuries, but where the lighthouse was built, there was never any reason to think that the sand would ever be any kind of threat.
For over 20 years, the tower's light and foghorn penetrated darkness and mist to keep vessels clear of the dangerous shallows. By the 1920s, however, the Rubjerg Mile dune had arrived on its doorstep, to the horror of engineers.
They just tried to do a sort of King Canute and stop the sand in its tracks. They put barriers in the way to stop the sand migrating. On doing so, there was a big traffic jam of sand building up, and the dune got bigger and bigger. So actually then you've created a bigger problem because you've created a bigger dune.
In an unlikely twist, the 200-foot cliff that made the lighthouse so visible now acted as a ramp and carried the slow-moving tsunami of sand up and over the lighthouse complex.
the sand had made its way all the way up that cliff and had swallowed up the buildings around Rubia-Canuda.
The sand was laying around the lighthouse, and big dunes were built up there, and higher.
Though the sands have now shifted position, in 1953, the dune actually grew higher than the lighthouse itself. Trapped in a hollow in the sand, the light and fog signal were no longer clear to ships at sea.
The only way they figured they could save the lighthouse was by continuously digging away the sand around the base. But even then, they must have known this was a battle against nature they were never going to win.
In 1968, authorities finally gave up the battle against the flood of sand, and the light was decommissioned. Yet the tower itself and its surviving buildings became a museum and study center for sand dune movement. Ironically, though the peak of the massive dune had long moved on, the museum itself was slowly crushed by the sand and closed in 2002, when the whole site was finally abandoned. Today, the lighthouse at Rubia-Canuda is an empty shell. Every year, thousands of visitors climb the mountain of sand to explore its haunting remains. The onshore winds that suffocated the light with sand have also scoured away the cliff on which it stands.
The coastline is coming too close and closer, so in a few years, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, there's no lighthouse any longer.
The rolling dunes may have snuffed out the light, but in the very near future, erosion will cause the mighty tower to collapse into the waves. The engineers who built the lighthouse believed its location and solid construction could withstand anything the elements could throw at it. But they didn't anticipate the extraordinary power of the wind to transform the landscape itself.
There's always a need to take into account your natural surroundings. But Mother Nature has a way of continuously reminding you who's really in charge.
Now abandoned, they were once on the cutting edge of human engineering. Within these decaying structures are the echoes of history. They speak of war and terror, but also of exploration and human endeavor.